I didn't even want to go to brunch that Sunday. I had a backlog of reports to file for the Bureau, water table contamination studies from counties no one could pronounce. But the kids insisted. Sophie had driven all the way from Davis, and Aaron had actually shaved. That was rare. They sat across from me at the outdoor cafe, all sunshine and cheap enthusiasm, pushing a gift bag at me like it contained something that might change my life. I expected socks. Inside was a gas station scratcher. Purple foil, corny cartoon font. Father's Day Fortune, it read. I smiled because that's what you do when your children, both technically adults, give you something that cost less than a decent cup of coffee. It was the kind of thing you pretend to scratch and then leave in your glove compartment for 6 months. But Sophie wouldn't let it go. You have to scratch it now, Dad. It's tradition. Since when, I thought, but I played along. I pulled out the plastic fork from my side plate and scraped away at the metallic surface. The symbols emerged slowly: $, gold bar, treasure chest, all meaningless until the 4th row. That's when I paused. 3 matching 80 million symbols. I blinked, looked at the card, back at them. They were mid-laugh, joking about the omelet selection, unaware. Sophie, I said, where did you get this? The chevron off 5th. Why? I held the card up without speaking. Aaron leaned across the table and snatched it. No way, he whispered. We didn't make a scene, but the silence at our table must have caught attention. A waiter came over. Sophie whispered something and he backed away like we were contagious. An hour later, we were in the back office of the gas station, where a clerk confirmed what none of us could believe. The ticket wasn't fake. It was part of a new promotion. A legitimate, state-run jackpot. The California lottery rep called it an extraordinary Father's Day story. I called it absurd. The odds of winning were 1 in 300 million. I'd spent my entire life avoiding risk. And then fate, or some mathematically impossible wind, blew $80 million into my lap through a $5 scratcher. By Monday, the press had found me. First a local reporter, then a syndicated morning show. One news van even followed me into the Target parking lot while I bought new dish soap and a phone charger. They wanted a feel-good headline. The environmental bureaucrat turned millionaire. How will this change your life? They asked again and again. It didn't. I declined interviews. I shut down social media. I didn't buy a house in Napa or a boat or a stake in some doomed startup. I paid off my ex-wife's mortgage, gave each of my kids a modest trust, and declined the rest. The real changes were quiet. I stopped setting an alarm. I started sleeping through the night for the first time in years. I took longer walks, slow enough to hear birdsong under traffic. I sat in diners with bad coffee and thought about nothing at all. But there was one thing I couldn't ignore. One file. One case that kept creeping into my thoughts like a forgotten itch. It had been buried years ago. A routine inspection that turned into a red flag. Soil samples near a construction site with off-the-chart readings of benzene and trichloroethylene, compounds that don't just show up without cause. I'd written the report, submitted it up the chain, and heard nothing. Then came a call from a liaison at corporate who thanked me for my concerns and assured me it had been addressed. The next week, I was reassigned. No explanation. Back then, I didn't have the leverage. Just a government job, a modest pension in the making, and 2 kids to raise. But now? Now I had time. And money. And no one to answer to. That kind of power isn't flashy. It doesn't come with champagne or Teslas or whisper campaigns. It arrives slowly, like a tide. You don't even notice it at first, the way people return your calls faster, the way doors open that used to stay closed. All because you can write a check without blinking. I didn't want revenge. I wasn't angry. But I hadn't forgotten. That file still lived in a brown banker's box under my bed. I pulled it out that week, not out of spite, but out of something harder to define: unfinished business, maybe. Or the uncomfortable knowledge that sometimes luck isn't about what you get. It's about what you do with it. The thing about working in environmental compliance is that nobody notices you until it's too late. Most of the time, it's dull, spreadsheets, lab results, outdated zoning maps, and bureaucratic memos worded so carefully you forget what they even mean. My title at the California Environmental Oversight Bureau was Senior Regional Field Analyst, but that was just a fancy way of saying I drove long distances to take dirt samples and file paperwork no one read. Still, I liked it. It was quiet, predictable, useful in the way bridges and water pressure are useful, things you don't think about until they fail. I wasn't out to change the world. I just wanted it not to fall apart under our feet. But in 2014, I filed a report that didn't disappear quietly like the rest. It was a site outside Woodland Hills, a luxury eco-housing development built on what they claimed was remediated farmland. The developer was a rising star named Charles Wendell. Young, charming, all solar panels and smiles. He'd just finished a TED Talk on ethical growth for the 21st century. He called it green capitalism with teeth. I didn't trust him. My team was sent out after a routine complaint from a nearby farm. Water tasted off, animals acting strange. Nothing official, but I took it seriously. Soil samples came back with TCE levels 3 times the federal limit and benzene, which wasn't even supposed to be there at all. Both are carcinogens. Both seep. Both linger. I filed a formal site contamination notice, attached lab results, and submitted a Level 2 violation recommendation to the department head. I remember staying late that night to write it clearly, like a prosecutor building a case. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a warning. 3 days later, my report was downgraded. Insufficient cause for escalation, the internal note said. When I asked why, I was told it had been reviewed by a higher interagency liaison. Wendell's office called me directly. Not the man himself, someone who introduced himself as a liaison for community engagement. He thanked me for my vigilance and assured me the issue had been a clerical error. The soil had been mislabeled. The lab result misfiled. Nothing to worry about. He even offered me tickets to some industry event in San Francisco. Just a thank you for your time, he said. I declined. 2 weeks later, I was reassigned to agricultural runoff in Yolo County. My Woodland Hills files were removed from the shared drive. I asked about them once. Got a shrug in return. It wasn't enough to call it a cover-up. Not then. Nothing illegal had been proven. But it felt wrong. The kind of wrong that festers if you let it. I kept a hard copy of everything: sample photos, chain of custody forms, the initial violation memo. I never looked at them again. Until now. Back then, I didn't have the resources to push back. Every agency has its quiet rules. If you push too hard, they move you. If you push again, they let you go. And I had child support payments, student loans, a rusted-out Honda that wouldn't survive another winter. So I moved on. Or told myself I had. But now, a decade later, sitting in a paid-off house with nothing but time and $80 million I didn't ask for, the silence around that file started to feel louder. And Charles Wendell was no longer some young developer. He was a mogul. A darling of the sustainability circuit. His face was on billboards for eco-luxury condos and green mega projects across the state. He'd even been shortlisted for a state commission on environmental innovation. But I remembered what he buried. I still had the paperwork. And now, finally, I had the power to do something with it. It started with a phone call to a friend I hadn't spoken to in 8 years. Victor Leland was a former senior investigator at the Bureau, sharp, meticulous, and cynical in all the right ways. He'd left after a sudden departmental restructuring, which everyone knew meant he'd asked too many questions too loudly. Last I heard, he was running background checks for a risk consultancy firm out of Oakland. When I called, I didn't mention the money. I just asked if he remembered the Woodland Hills case. There was a pause on the line, then a low whistle. Hell of a ghost to dig up, Dave. He agreed to meet. We sat in the back of a diner, far from the windows. I paid cash. Victor still had the instinct of a man who didn't want to be seen. I told him I was doing a personal review. He didn't press. But I could see the calculation in his eyes, the way he watched me over the rim of his coffee cup, registering the small changes, the watch I never used to wear, the ease with which I paid the bill. Just be careful, he said before he left. You're not the first one to poke this bear. I began assembling my tools like a surgeon preparing for quiet work. No noise. No headlines. First, I used a private contact at the records board to request the original report archive, internal memos, emails, anything connected to Project Sycamore, Wendell's flagship housing development. The archive had been marked as inactive. Some files had been accidentally purged. But for a generous donation to the department's retirement fund, backups began to resurface. Then came the legal side. I quietly hired a legal researcher, a former paralegal from an environmental law firm in San Jose who had since gone freelance. Her name was Nina, and she worked like a machine. I didn't tell her the full story, just that I was compiling a historical liability review of a high-risk real estate portfolio. She dug through decades of Wendell's construction permits, subcontractor records, third-party environmental audits, and water diversion variances. The red flags were subtle, but their unusual inspection gaps, labs with conflicts of interest, metadata mismatches on signed reports. Death by paper cuts. Next, I reached out to a few former employees from the Bureau who'd vanished quietly after the case. A soil technician. A junior compliance officer. One had moved to Seattle. Another now worked for a nonprofit in Santa Cruz. I called carefully. Some didn't want to talk. One hung up immediately. But a few remembered. They told me what I already suspected. Pressure from above. Phone calls they weren't supposed to take. Data rewritten. Reports downgraded for clarity. Each conversation felt like dusting off an old bone. Nothing conclusive yet. Just fragments. But they were starting to fit together. I didn't have a plan. Not yet. But I had something better. I had direction. And this time, I wasn't going to look away. I hadn't seen Charles Wendell in person since that industry luncheon a decade ago, the one where he wore a linen blazer in February and gave a speech about healing the planet through intelligent urban design. He'd smiled like a movie star, shook hands like a senator, and left before dessert. Even then, I could tell he didn't remember me. I was a name on a report someone else had buried. But now, I wasn't just a name. I'd set up a shell entity through a boutique firm in Palo Alto and used it to quietly purchase a 5-acre plot bordering the Sycamore Estates watershed. According to the county assessor, the land was recreationally zoned scrub, which meant nothing to most, but everything to someone like me. That particular strip bordered an underground runoff channel from Wendell's earliest development, a place where the water never quite settled right, where soil turned strange colors after the rain. I didn't need the land. I needed access. The purchase triggered a whisper. One of Wendell's project managers flagged it. A low-priority alert. Probably a coincidence. But Wendell didn't like coincidences. At first, he brushed it off. Even when he heard my name. David Linwood? I imagine him saying to his assistant. The compliance guy from back then? He would have laughed. People like him always laugh first. But then, more dots began to connect. Wendell's legal team got wind that I'd retained an environmental consulting firm, small, independent, highly specialized. Quiet, but thorough. The kind of group that doesn't advertise, doesn't schmooze, and doesn't answer to shareholders. That made him uneasy. He called me. I let it go to voicemail. The message was short. Friendly. Too friendly. Hey David, it's Charles Wendell. I heard through the grapevine that you're working on some kind of project near our old stomping grounds. Would love to chat. Let's grab a coffee sometime. No pressure. No pressure, a phrase that always carries pressure. I didn't respond. A week later, a man in an expensive jacket showed up near the property I'd bought. He claimed to be a hiker, but his shoes were too clean. My consultant, a grizzled hydrologist named Raj, clocked him from a distance. Raj had done fieldwork in the Andes. He knew when someone didn't belong in a place. 2 days after that, the county inspector showed up. A routine compliance check on recreational zoning limitations. The timing was surgical. They asked for site access. I granted it. There was nothing to hide. That was the point. Wendell wasn't panicking yet. He was probing, measuring my movements, trying to gauge how serious I was. Whether this was a personal vendetta or just the curiosity of a bored retiree playing watchdog. He didn't understand yet that it wasn't personal. It was procedural. That's what would make it lethal. In his world, enemies are loud, brash, political. I wasn't that. I filed no public claims. I made no media noise. But I was placing pressure exactly where it mattered: on records, on soil, on groundwater pathways, on land no one else had cared about until now. And Wendell, he was beginning to understand that I wasn't here to bark. I was here to document. And once the right files surfaced, once the data was independently verified, once the evidence formed a picture even a well-funded legal team couldn't obscure, there would be no deniability. Only consequence. The soil told its story in silence. We took samples in pairs, always early in the morning, always after a rain. That's when the toxins tend to rise, pushed upward by pressure differentials and disturbed sediment. Raj, the retired hydrologist I'd hired, moved like a man half his age. He had the patience of erosion, the kind of man who once traced a chromium leak through 4 miles of fractured bedrock. He didn't talk much, but when he did, he didn't waste syllables. "Something's leaching through here," he said on the second day, crouching over a dull patch of soil near the eastern fence line. Old. Persistent. Not natural. That was the beginning of confirmation. I paid for 3 independent labs, not because I didn't trust them, but because I didn't trust the system that might later discredit them. All labs were certified, all blind tested. Samples were split under video documentation. I logged every vial, every chain of custody. Redundancy wasn't caution, it was armor. The results came back the following week. TCE again. Tetrachloroethylene. Benzene. All present in measurable concentrations. In some spots, the levels were more than twice the legal limit for groundwater contamination under both state and federal guidelines. Carcinogenic. Mutagenic. Linked to leukemia clusters in children, liver and kidney failure in long-term exposure cases. The kind of stuff that doesn't just get there by accident. I remember staring at the first report alone at my dining table. No music. Just the hum of the refrigerator and the weight of what I already suspected confirmed in ink and decimals. I wasn't excited. I wasn't vindicated. If anything, I felt tired. Because this wasn't a victory. This was the start of work. I began building what I now think of as the quietest bomb I've ever held, a case file so painfully meticulous it could have been a bureaucrat's thesis. Every page had to be unassailable. No assumptions, no flair. Just cross-referenced facts, dated statements, photos with geolocation stamps, lab signatures, environmental models, long-forgotten topographical surveys retrieved from county archives. I funded air dispersion simulations and groundwater flow modeling using archived meteorological data from the past decade. I charted how rainfall and runoff from Sycamore Estates might have carried contaminants into surrounding aquifers. Raj provided the overlays. Nina, my legal researcher, compiled legal precedents, past contamination rulings, remediation cases, whistleblower protections. We weren't aiming to accuse. We were preparing to expose. In public, I remained invisible. I shopped at the same grocery store. I paid my taxes. I waved to neighbors. But my house became a bunker of information, folders stacked with precision, binders labeled with dry phrases like erosion control audit, 2013, and soil batch variance memo, parcel 22C. No one would care about these words now. But one day, someone would. And when they did, they wouldn't be able to look away. Wendell, I knew, was watching. He had eyes on the parcel and probably on me. But his problem was that I gave him nothing to attack. I never accused him. I filed no injunctions. I issued no press releases. I was, in every technical sense, just another man doing his due diligence. That's what unnerved him. Because in his world, enemies yell. They posture. They run to the media and try to win in the court of public opinion. But I didn't want attention. I wanted accountability. And accountability, in its truest form, lives in the fine print. It was around this time that Raj handed me something he hadn't planned to, a map from the mid-90s showing the original grading plan for the land that became Sycamore Estates. According to the overlays, the area where our strongest contaminant readings came from used to be a dry well, an unlined dump site from before Wendell's development broke ground. It had never been disclosed. Not to the city. Not to regulators. Not to buyers. That alone was enough to trigger a cascade of liabilities. But I didn't rush to file anything. Instead, I added it to the binder. Labeled it clearly. logged it with page numbers and witness annotations. Everything in its place. This wasn't about surprise. It was about undeniability. People think power is loud. It isn't. Real power, the kind that changes policy, reclaims poisoned land, and ruins men who think they're untouchable, is quiet. It builds slowly, page by page, signature by signature. And when it finally speaks, it doesn't shout. It doesn't need to. The cease and desist letter arrived on a Thursday morning, couriered to my front door by a man in an expensive wool coat who barely made eye contact. It was printed on thick ivory paper, watermarked with the insignia of one of the top litigation firms in San Francisco. The kind of firm that didn't answer phones unless there were at least 4 commas in the retainer. The claim? Defamation. Tortious interference. Harassment. Even something called reputational sabotage, which sounded like a term invented for rich men who hate consequences. I sat at my kitchen table and read it twice. They weren't accusing me of publishing false information because I hadn't published anything. No media campaign. No social smear. Just quiet research. What they took issue with was the fact that I'd hired environmental consultants and had engaged in behavior reasonably construed as threatening to the reputational and financial standing of Mr. Charles Wendell. In simpler terms, they knew I was onto something and they wanted to scare me off. But I'd been expecting this. Men like Wendell don't wait for storms. They manufacture them. Preemptive aggression disguised as legal posture, it's textbook. So I didn't panic. I didn't call friends. I didn't post about it online. I made a single phone call to the firm I had quietly retained 3 months earlier. Bray and Yoon Environmental Law. Not flashy, not loud, but lethal in deposition rooms and federal hearings. They'd handled some of the largest toxic tort cases on the West Coast, and more importantly, they knew how to work in silence. Their lead counsel, Deirdre Yoon, had once brought down a major petroleum syndicate without stepping in front of a single camera. I liked her immediately. When I forwarded the letter, she replied in under 5 minutes. Expected. Paper tiger. Let us handle it. By the end of the day, her team had filed a formal rebuttal and preemptive counterclaim for harassment and attempted intimidation of a potential whistleblower under both federal and California protections. They cited the Whistleblower Protection Act, SECA provisions, and a recent appellate precedent involving similar tactics used by a mining company in Nevada. Wendell's lawyers would be forced to explain why they were suing someone who hadn't yet made a public allegation, and why they'd hired private investigators to monitor the property of a man quietly testing his own land. It was strategic overreach, and Deirdre was surgical in response. Meanwhile, Wendell's PR machine kicked into gear. Articles started circulating, glowing features about his philanthropy, his green energy scholarships, his recent partnership with an environmental startup focused on algae-based biofuel. Interviews. Panels. A podcast appearance titled Building Green in a Gray World. It was smoke. A distraction. But even smoke casts shadows. I wasn't interested in the noise. I was building something deeper than outrage. Stronger than headlines. I was building a record. And now his first punch had missed, which meant he'd make another. And I'd be ready. There was no press conference. No podiums. No cameras. No statements read aloud to a wall of flashing lights. Just a packet. 2 inches thick. Bound neatly. Titled plainly, Petition for Formal Review of Sycamore Estates Site Contamination and Regulatory Misconduct. On the cover, my name, my former bureau credentials, and a list of 42 attachments, soil analyses, flow models, chain of custody logs, interagency memos, archived inspection reports, affidavits, and a signed declaration of findings under penalty of perjury. It didn't shout. It didn't need to. I filed it with the EPA regional office first. Not the national branch, that would have buried it in months of protocol. I knew the local reps. I knew their tempo, their blind spots, and more importantly, their internal leak points. Within 48 hours, someone had quietly forwarded the file to a reporter at the Sacramento Tribune, then to an editor at the San Francisco Independent, then to a blogger who specialized in environmental corruption and had a surprisingly loyal podcast audience. No headlines yet, but sparks. It wasn't my voice that caught their attention. It was the math. The parts per billion. The regression curves. The overlay maps showing migration patterns of benzene through subsoil strata and the proximity to elementary school wells. Cold, boring, undeniable. One journalist emailed me, "This isn't just data. It's a blueprint for a disaster no one wanted to admit." And just like that, the shape of the story changed. Whispers began to surface. A former lab technician from a subcontractor Wendell used in 2015 wrote a long comment thread under the podcast post, anonymously at first, then under her own name. She said her team had flagged inconsistencies in well depths during construction, but were told to revise the reports for clarity. Another man, a former assistant project manager who now worked as a park ranger in Oregon, came forward with emails, screenshots, draft versions of site audits that had been mysteriously edited after submission. I didn't ask them to come forward. They just did. One by one, the silence that had blanketed this issue for years began to lift. Not with anger. Not with fanfare. Just a growing recognition that something wrong had been done, and that someone, finally, was doing something about it. Wendell tried to dismiss it as a smear. His publicist issued a statement calling my petition the vengeful obsession of a disgruntled former bureaucrat. But that only made people more curious. The documents were public now. Anyone could read them. And unlike Wendell's carefully worded denials, my pages were filled with names, numbers, cross-references, dated lab work, and boring little footnotes that made it all real. One reporter described it best: Wendell gave us charisma. Linwood gave us citations. Soon, a small crowd began to gather at the boundary of the land I'd bought: journalists, citizen watchdogs, even a few graduate students with clipboards and boots. They weren't protesting. They were watching. I never addressed them directly. I kept working, filing, documenting. Deirdre handled the follow-up filings with the EPA and the County Environmental Board. We requested an injunction against future land sales in the area pending full investigation. A few days later, a junior representative from the Department of Toxic Substances Control visited my property unannounced. He had questions. And that was the moment I knew we had moved from speculation to scrutiny. Wendell wasn't facing outrage. He was facing evidence. And in a world built on image, that's the one thing he couldn't rebrand. I've never liked courtrooms. They're too quiet in the wrong ways, not the thoughtful kind of quiet, but the tense, performative kind, like everyone's waiting for someone to trip. Even the carpet absorbs your footsteps in a way that makes you self-conscious. But I sat there anyway, second row behind our table, dressed in a suit I hadn't worn since my daughter's graduation. I wasn't a plaintiff. I wasn't even called to testify. I didn't need to be. Deirdre sat at the front, flanked by her team, no theatrics, no paper shuffling for effect. Just a laptop, a binder, and a voice that didn't rise above conversation level. She wasn't here to perform. She was here to dismantle. Wendell, to his credit, looked calm. Crisp navy suit. Polished shoes. Hands folded neatly in front of him. But his eyes moved too much. Not scanning, searching. Like a man waiting for a sudden noise that never came. His lawyer spoke first. Mr. Wendell is the target of a reputational campaign based on conjecture, obsolete data, and a misinterpretation of environmental modeling. These accusations are not only speculative, they are malicious in intent. Deirdre waited until he finished. She didn't flinch. Just stood and began projecting exhibits onto the monitor, not sensational documents, but dull ones. Compliance logs. Soil chain of custody reports. Copies of third-party lab results with timestamp metadata. Audit trails that showed document revisions at times when no new testing had occurred. The judge, a woman with sharp features and no patience for grandstanding, said little. Occasionally, she adjusted her glasses. Mostly, she just listened. "Can you explain why this inspection report lists 5 wells?" Deirdre asked Wendell's head of construction, when the original schematic, filed 2 weeks earlier, lists only 4? I believe there was an amendment. And was that amendment filed with the county as required? No, I believe it was an internal correction. And who signed off on that? Silence. Later, she introduced an affidavit from the former subcontractor, the one who'd initially flagged well-depth issues. It described how her emails had been ignored and how her final report was returned with suggested edits that removed language about volatile organic compounds. Wendell's team objected. Hearsay. Unverified. The judge overruled them. The statement had already been verified, notarized, and included in the EPA's preliminary review. No yelling. No breakdowns. Just the sound of precision. By the third day, Wendell's attorneys had stopped trying to discredit the data. Their strategy shifted toward minimizing impact. They claimed the contamination was historical, predating Wendell's ownership. That the site had passed inspections during early construction phases. That the levels weren't high enough to warrant alarm. Deirdre nodded through all of it, then calmly pulled up the purchase agreement Wendell had signed, the one that included a clause stating he had personally reviewed the environmental remediation plan. His signature sat in the corner, dated and clean. There was no audible gasp. No dramatic objection. Just a stillness in the room that said enough. The judge made no remarks. She didn't need to. The next step would come later, in her written opinion, in the motions to follow. But we knew. We'd laid the body of the truth on the table, layer by layer, until there was nothing left for Wendell's people to deny. Not with a tweet. Not with a donation. Not with a smiling photograph in front of a solar farm. It wasn't about rage. It was about records. And in that courtroom, Wendell finally understood something I'd known from the beginning. He'd built his empire on charisma and control. But this fight? This fight was about proof. The judgment came quietly, like everything else in this story. No gavel bang. No dramatic courtroom exhale. Just a 7-page ruling released digitally on a Tuesday afternoon. I read it at my kitchen table, same place I'd first opened the lab results, same worn coffee ring in the corner. The language was precise. The court found Wendell and his affiliated entities negligent in their environmental oversight, materially misleading in regulatory disclosures, and in violation of multiple state and federal safety mandates. The judge didn't use adjectives. She used citations. The site was ordered shut down immediately, pending remediation. The ruling triggered a domino of consequences Wendell had likely prepared for, but not fully anticipated. His corporate licenses revoked. Construction permits suspended. A separate review was launched into every other development he'd built in the past decade. Investors fled first, then board members, then press allies. He didn't make a statement. For a man who built an empire on visibility, his silence was louder than anything I could have said. More importantly, the ruling didn't just punish, it repaired. The court ordered an environmental restitution fund, financed by liquidated assets from Wendell's holding companies. Residents in the surrounding communities, including those who'd unknowingly lived near tainted wells, began receiving letters, eligibility notices for medical screenings, water filtration systems, relocation grants. Some of the letters were addressed to families who'd never known what made their kids sick. Now they had answers. Not all of them, but enough. I didn't attend the press briefing, but I saw the photos, a modest podium on the steps of the municipal building, a plain white backdrop with the EPA logo, and a handful of reporters holding copies of my petition, now public record. No one mentioned my name. That was fine. I hadn't done this to be seen. I did it so no one else would have to dig through a decade of lies just to prove something invisible was killing them. A few weeks later, I was invited to testify not in court, but before the State Environmental Policy Board. They were proposing new guidelines for soil integrity audits, third-party testing independence, and whistleblower reinforcement within public agencies. They asked for my input. I gave it. Not as an expert, just as a man who once tried to submit a report that went nowhere. That part of me, the version from 10 years ago, sat with me in that hearing. I remembered how it felt to be moved off a case without reason, to have your silence purchased not with money, but with consequence. And now I got to rewrite that ending. After the hearing, a younger compliance officer approached me. Nervous. Eager. She said she'd read the case files twice. She wanted to know how I stayed calm through it all. I told her the truth. You don't win by being loud. You win by being right. And that only works if you're patient enough to wait for the truth to catch up. The house hasn't changed much. Same creaky steps. Same stubborn window in the hallway that never quite shuts when it rains. The yard is neater now. Sophie insisted on hiring a gardener after the case ended. Said I'd earned one small indulgence. But the mailbox still leans left, and the coffee maker still rattles for 30 seconds before settling into its rhythm. I like it that way. It's been 6 months since the ruling. The headlines moved on. Another scandal. Another election cycle. But the impact stayed, like groundwater beneath dry soil. You don't always see change from above, but it moves slow and permanent under the surface. I've set up a scholarship fund under no one's name, just a quiet grant for students pursuing environmental science, particularly those from communities affected by contamination or development neglect. The paperwork is modest. The application asks for 3 things: curiosity, persistence, and proof of hardship. We've already funded 7 students. Sophie is one of them, not as a recipient, but as a mentor. She transferred her major from economics to environmental policy. Says she wants to work at the intersection of law and justice. I never asked her to. I never told her what to do. But I can see it now, the fire in her, the certainty. It's not about the money. It's about meaning. Aaron, who once laughed at my endless filing cabinets, just started law school. He says he wants to represent people who don't have the language to fight back. I asked him what changed. He just shrugged. Turns out Dad's job wasn't boring after all. We still have Sunday brunch most weeks. It's different now, not because we're wealthier, but because there's no weight between us anymore. No unspoken disappointment. No wondering if I'd ever made a difference. I've stopped checking the news for Wendell's name. Last I heard, he was still in litigation, dozens of lawsuits, a few criminal investigations, assets frozen. He'll fade. Not with a bang, but with a quiet exit behind closed doors. The same way he built his empire, just in reverse. I don't gloat. I don't think about him much. The truth was never about him. It was about the people who drank the water. The parents who wondered why their kids kept getting sick. The inspectors who buried their instincts because they had mortgages and bosses. It was about the quiet records that spoke when no one else could. And now I sleep better. Not because I'm richer. Because I'm done carrying the weight of a truth no one wanted to look at. Most mornings, I wake before the sun. I make coffee. I sit by the window and watch the sky shift from gray to gold. Sometimes I open one of the old binders, just to remind myself what it took. Not to dwell, but to remember. That silence is not peace. And that some things are worth seeing through, even if it takes a decade.